So historically speaking, when people have thought about knowledge management, they've really thought about it in the concept of service. I have internal employees who need to be able to search our knowledge management to find resolutions to cases or items that they're working through. And over the course of time, knowledge management has really evolved into not only just internal self-service for employees, but it's also really come into kind of a self-service functionality for your customers as well. And so as you're doing more and more Dynamics 365 implementations, you're going to see that knowledge management ends up being one of those kind of key pieces, and it's not necessarily just a service-based functionality anymore. And that's why we always thought it was real important for us to really examine how that configuration process looks like and what does knowledge management look like in terms of Dynamics 365. So as you're configuring these implementations, you can come up with a clear defined strategy on how you want to use knowledge management moving forward. So in this module, what we want to do is talk just a little bit about, how did we get here? What are some of the knowledge options that are available from a Dynamics 365 perspective, not only today, but also as we're moving forward, because there's been some changes on some things that are coming that could affect how you're moving forward within the context of handling knowledge and knowledge integration. We're going to talk just a little bit about the new kind of updated knowledge articles that were introduced in a previous version, but now have kind of transferred over into Dynamics 365 and what advantage that's going to give you. We're not necessarily going to talk a lot about the creation of the articles per se, as much as just the configuration elements around them and what some of the options are that are available when you start looking at how you're going to set some of that functionality up. We want to talk a little bit about knowledge searching and showing you how you can enable knowledge searching across entities and not necessarily just associate knowledge articles with the case entity anymore, but how can I expand on that functionality and maybe transfer that over into the account or the opportunity or a contact, depending upon what the situation might be, or more realistically, probably a custom entity, depending upon what type of delivery mechanism you're working with. And then just have the conversation about how does external access fit into what you might be wanting to do moving forward with these knowledge articles, so you have a definite plan where if you're going to be surfacing this on like a CRM portal or some maybe other external provider, what that process looks like so you can work through that as you're moving forward. Let's first talk about the big picture from a knowledge management perspective. Obviously, it all starts with articles. You're going to create different knowledge-based articles inside your deployment that are going to be used across the board in a variety of different situations. Now, historically, those have always been associated with cases, but as we talked about at kind of the top of the module, it really could come into any different type of scenario. You may be using custom entities to reflect some type of business that you're working with, and allowing knowledge-based articles to be able to facilitate those options might be a nice situation from that standpoint. Maybe you handle shipping information and you associate shipping information with orders, and so now you want to be able to surface knowledge-based articles on the order entity to be able to look at shipping issues that may have arisen. However you're kind of working through that process, ultimately what's ended up happening is you need to surface that information through entities so people can search that information. And you also want to get intelligent over time. So as people start to search those individual items, what's taking place, what's happening inside there that's going to constitute different situations, so the search results that you're getting back are more intelligent as you're going through. And we want to be able to do things like automation to be able to handle, custom approval processes and work things through, but also be able to handle when items are published up into our knowledge base, but when maybe they expire, so they're no longer valid. And we want to look at things like portal access to understand that more and more customers and more consumers are going to want to be able to consume that information directly through a portal. And then ultimately we want to be able to measure how useful these articles are. Are people taking advantage of them? Are they entering are they finding that information? Is an article being used a lot or not very much? Are there ways that we could better how we push that information across? And so it's important to understand that from a knowledge management standpoint, there's all these different facets that really play into what it is that you're doing. Now, let's just talk a little bit about what knowledge management looks like from a Dynamics 365 perspective. Now, if you think back to kind of the traditional Dynamics CRM days, there was always this concept of articles that were traditional, quote unquote CRM articles that were available. They worked for very limited types of situations, but they didn't have a lot of searching capabilities. The editor was somewhat limited. There wasn't any real options around expiration or any of those things. So you really didn't have a lot of the analytics that you would hope to have from an application standpoint. So then a few versions back, they introduced Parature integration. Now, I want to mention Parature integration because Parature integration is still a viable option with Dynamics 365 as long as you're using Dynamics 365 online and you have it associated with a Parature instance. You can integrate the applications together and use Parature's knowledge management functionality inside the application. Now, one of the things that I want to kind of caution or talk a little bit about is from a Parature perspective, Parature in regards to how the application functions today is slowly starting to be phased out. So there is not going to be any new Parature options available from a subscription standpoint. So while I want to mention Parature from a standpoint of if you're an existing customer with a Parature subscription, that will continue to be supported as long as Parature is in existence from a CRM perspective. But moving forward with Dynamics 365, there's really going to be this transition to the true Dynamics 365 knowledge articles. And the nice thing about the Dynamics 365 knowledge articles is they do support things like major and minor versions. They do have search analytic capabilities where you can actually configure it to search for individual records based upon what people are typing into the searching title when they're working with it. You do have the capabilities if you have your own custom portal or if you have a portal that you're working with through through Dynamics 365, you can actually publish that information up to an external portal and make those knowledge articles available to customers who are surfacing through them. You have the ability to do things like delay when items are being published. You can set up archiving and expirations. You can do translations, so you can create an article in multiple languages, and then based upon the person that is trying to work through that article, if that article is available in their native language, it'll actually make it available for those processes as well. And not to mention the fact that it has a more intensified WYSIWYG editor that you can use to really embed more images and links into the article and really make the article more user-friendly from a design standpoint. But as you publish these articles out and people start using these articles in the real world, you have a full set of analytics that you can now come into and capture and determine how that process has been working and what people are doing. So it really gives you kind of a nice mechanism that you can use as you're moving forward to really manage those options. But from an application and an integration standpoint, the Dynamics 365 implementation right now does allow you to do integration with your traditional Dynamic or with your current Dynamics 365 knowledge articles, as well as maybe integrate with a Parature implementation if need be. So what are some of the advantages to using knowledge functionality and knowledge searching functionality inside Dynamics 365? So as you can see kind of on the screenshot, right in here on kind of your task area, I have a KB records. And this allows me inline searching of my knowledge base directly from the context of any record within CRM that's been, or within Dynamics 365 that's been enabled for knowledge management. So traditionally this would be things like the case entity, but as we've talked about, it really could be any entity that you wanted to work with. The nice thing about the searching functionality is, again, depending upon what your implementation is, you can search Dynamics 365 records or Parature records if need be, but it does support multiple languages. So based upon what your native language is, if the knowledge article exists in that native language, when you're searching for that information inside here, it'll actually give you the capabilities to see those knowledge articles in your native language. There's also a language filter in here that allows you to switch that information to different language options. So if you do find if your native language is English, but you want to be able to send that article to somebody that speaks Spanish, as long as the article exists in Spanish, there are mechanisms in place that you could go ahead and facilitate sending that information out. The nice thing about this is also gives you the capabilities to search as you type. Now, typically it's going to use the case title, but when you start talking about Azure Analytics and text analytics and machine learning, over time, it can get more intelligent based upon specific fields, and it can now start to communicate back to your results based upon multiple fields and understand kind of key phrases and do more kind of fuzzy matching as opposed to some of the exact matching functionality that it typically does. But that's a kind of an additional piece that you have the ability to surface. So what you can do is now, once you've facilitated that article and you've done a search for that article inside the application, now you can just look at that article in the context of of the record itself. You could open that up into a separate window if need be and analyze it from there, but you also would now have the capabilities to email that article or a link to that article to external customers. So if it's surfaced out on your portal and you wanted to be able to link that item together, you could do that. Or if you wanted to associate that record with a specific Dynamics 365 record, you would be able to do that as well. And now you get that analytics piece. So now I can see how many active cases or active orders or whatever the item might be are actually using those search results inside or using that knowledge article inside the context of the application. So it really becomes a powerful tool to provide those baseline analytics for your customers when they're working through. So I'd like to spend just a little bit of time showing you how to enable and configure the knowledge searching functionality from within a Dynamics 365 implementation. Now I mentioned kind of at the top of the module that historically you see knowledge management really associated with service-based functionality and capabilities, but it's really morphed into other entities across the board as well. With that being said, you still access it through kind of the service management settings. And so I want to talk just a little bit about how that process looks like. The nice thing about knowledge management functionality is there's kind of a two-tier process. You can either enable it on an entity definition itself, or you can enable it through kind of the knowledge searching functionality. But then you have to specify how you want to use it. So again, it supports either Dynamics 365 or currently Parature if you have an existing Parature instance, but you have to pick one or the other. Remember that moving forward, Dynamics 365 is really going to be the preferred method. And if you are trying to connect with any kind of on-premise type situation, Dynamics 365 is really your only option from a knowledge management perspective. But let's go ahead and let's show you what that looks like inside the app itself. So I'm going to go into Settings and I'm going to go into Service Management. And if I scroll down, I'll see underneath Service Management, about halfway down, I'll see a knowledge-based management option. And there's two options in here. There's the embedded knowledge search functionality, and then there's the categories functionality. And so one of the things to remember, particularly if you're going to be surfacing this information externally, is you have this concept of being able to create kind of a category and a category tree hierarchy that you can associate specific knowledge articles with inside the application. And so what this categories allows you to do is to go in and define what that categorical structure might look like from an application standpoint. So I can define different category numbers that might reflect different types of situations. So I can see in here I have categories for defects, I have categories for delivery issues, return items, and some of these are all going to basically fall under different hierarchical options. So again, if I click on the hierarchy for any one of these individual options, I can see the hierarchy option that shows me where the delivery issues fits in kind of the grand scheme of things. So I have a support hierarchy that's broken down into defects, delivery issues, and then returns and exchanges. So I can see kind of my hierarchy in regards to how I'm working with it. What's nice about this is, again, if I were to expose this externally through like a portal, these categories are what are used to group individual items together. So when I want to see those options, I can work through them very specifically just by using and selecting the categories. So each article can be associated a category. If I go back into knowledge management and I go into embedded knowledge search, this is where I can configure the functionality. Now there's a two-tier process to be able to determine how you want to configure this functionality. I can just go straight into here, and eventually once it kind of loads up, it'll show me all the different entities that are available to be used within the knowledge searching functionality. Or I can go into a specific entity definition itself. So I can go into settings and customizations, and I can enable a functionality for knowledge search as well. Either way is ultimately going to give me the same end result. So in here, I can see that here's all my different entities. I can see that the case entity has been enabled for knowledge search at this point. If I wanted to, I could also go ahead and maybe associate it with the order, and I could also associate it with the account entity, which would now mean that I have the option to be able to facilitate that information inside the application. The next thing I have to define is where am I going to be pulling these knowledge articles from. So down here you'll see that this is that knowledge solution option. I can choose either Dynamics 365 or, again, if I'm an existing Parature customer, I can choose Parature, and then I just have to connect it to the Parature instance with the appropriate account ID and department ID. These are all available from a Parature perspective. Realistically, you're going to probably do this more often than not just through Dynamics 365. This now gives you the capabilities to go out and link this and associate this with a specific item. Now, I also could use an external portal, and in this external portal, if I had an address for the portal that I wanted to work with, I could use that URL format basically just by pointing to where I want those knowledge articles to be stored inside the application. In this case, I'm not necessarily going to associate it with an external portal, but this does give me the capabilities, if need be, to be able to facilitate that. And as long as I have kind of my configuration stuff set up, if I'm utilizing like portal capabilities, I do have the capabilities with portal capabilities for CRM to really just kind of set it up from this perspective. It automatically feeds it into here. I don't even necessarily have to use the external portal address if I don't want to. Then I can go ahead and I can hit next. It's going to determine that I've got everything set up and I've enabled it for my specific entities that I want to work with. And now I can go ahead and hit finish. And so now from this perspective, everything is set up from a searching criteria. So now I have to determine how I want to use this within the context of the application itself. And so you'll notice that we did enable it for orders, and we also enable it for accounts. So the next tier to this is you would actually want to go into the entity that you worked with and kind of configure the knowledge searching functionality for that specific entity. So I'm going to just go ahead and close out of here. I'm going to go into settings and I'm going to go into customizations. And we're going to customize the system. And we'll go into entities and accounts and we'll open up the account form. And so once I've opened up the form, now I can surface kind of my knowledge functionality. Now remember that from a Dynamics 365 perspective, you have kind of your traditional web client option that you can use for displaying and working with information inside the application, but you also have the interactive experience. And so if you have an entity like the account entity that's been enabled for the interactive experience, you do have to make sure that you're going in and working with those individual subgrids and options, and that you're turning on the functionality for any form that's going to be used to interface with the application. So if I, for example, were to come into here, and I were to open up the account form, this is where I can configure kind of my account-based functionality for the individual elements that I want to work with. So one of the options that you'll see under here is the knowledge-based search. So this is my knowledge-based search functionality that I can bring into kind of any tab or environment that I want to work with. In this case, we'll just go ahead and click on the knowledge-based search control, and it'll open up that functionality inside the application. So in this case, we're going to just go ahead and call this knowledge search. Now it's going to ask me as far as what are some of the different options that I want to work with. So how do I want to filter this information? Do I only want to look at published knowledge base articles? Do I only want to look at approved? Do I want to look at all kind of draft articles? What are the options that I want to look at when searching my situation? So again, I may have some articles that are kind of ready to go and that I've published and are out there. I may have some that are still kind of in an approval state. So you can define which ones you actually want to surface to your users, and then using the checkbox option here, you do have the capabilities to define whether or not the users can override that. You also have the ability to define your language filter. So in here, I can determine whether or not I want the user to use their default language, or if I have other user options I want to work with. I also can have the user change the filter language. So again, if my native language is English, but I'm working with someone who primarily speaks German, I would be able to look to see what articles are available in German, and if there's a German version of that article, I would now be able to surface that as part of my search results. The other situations that I can do in here is I can also turn on different suggestions. So again, the whole concept of as I'm typing functionality is where this is where I can turn on kind of record suggestions. So in here, I would have the capabilities to define this based upon a specific field value. So what field value do I want to use? And then I can associate that field value with a specific item. And then I also would have the capabilities to determine, ratings on knowledge base articles and allow people to actually rate those individual situations based upon specific fields as far as how people are working with this. So I could work through and rate individual items from those situations. But for right now, we'll just kind of leave it at this point. The nice thing about this, automatic suggestions is this is also where some of the machine analytics and machine learning, the text analytics functionality comes into play, because I could also, once I work through some of that functionality, replace this field value with like a machine learning definition and be able to use that to facilitate how that process looks in the application. But here you would go in and set this up for each individual element that you want to work with. And once you've kind of defined that knowledge search functionality and you've created that option, now you just kind of position that to wherever you want it to go on your specific form. And then you can save and publish your form, and then that will surface it inside the application so you can use it moving forward. So in this case, I'll just move it up here just a little bit. We'll go ahead and save and publish. And then once this is published, now I can go back into, like, per se, an account, and I could see that that knowledge functionality would be available directly in there based upon if I have any published articles or items that I've worked with. So I can close out of here. I can close out of here. I could now go into sales and accounts, open up a specific account, and now I can see options based upon these situations. So here it's plugging in information based upon the actual name of the item, but I could go in and type in, different elements. It'll search those options based upon those options. This is where I can see my different relevance options and then work with information from there. Now, we don't have a lot of published articles at this point, but it gives you the idea to see the concept in regards to what you could do here. So it's important to understand, if you are going to be using knowledge management in any capacity, how that's ultimately going to be delivered. Are you using it just strictly internally for internal users to access some of that information, or are you looking at external users coming in through some type of portal methodology to be able to facilitate that? Regardless of how it's going to be used, there's always that concept of what are we trying to track? Where do we want it to be available? How do we want it to be associated with different items? And so by using Dynamics 365, we have a lot of flexibility to determine how we build these knowledge articles, when they're pushed out to the application so they're available for people to work with, but ultimately how we track analytics moving forward. So from a Dynamics 365 perspective, keep in mind that if you do have a current Parature subscription, it's very easy to link that information to a Dynamics 365 instance for better consumption. But remember that that's ultimately something that's going to be moving away at some point. And so realistically, using the internal Dynamics 365 knowledge base instances do allow you to configure that for searching and associate those searching results with really any entity inside the application. The other option that's nice when you start talking about knowledge management capabilities is categories, and the category hierarchy structure can be defined to provide better flexibility for how you want to be able to organize those knowledge articles together as part of your implementation. And regardless of what you're working with, all of that information could also ultimately be exposed on an external portal. So now you have customers maybe coming into a customer self-service portal to be able to work through that. But you have several different configuration options that are available that allow you, when you're moving forward, to be able to implement very robust knowledge management solutions as part of your Dynamics 365 implementation.